In the middle of the night, someone knocks on a palace door in Istanbul. The man who opens it isn't an assassin, and he isn't a soldier, he's the city's chief of police. In his hand is a single piece of paper. According to that paper, the owner of this house is no longer a citizen of this country. Within the hour, he will pack, get into a car, and cross the border, never to return. This is not an ordinary man. He is the last caliph of the Islamic world. And that night, it isn't just him. Roughly 150 members of a 6th-century-old dynasty will share the same fate. Women, children, the elderly, all of them. In a single night, exiled from the land where they were born. Some will die in poverty in France. Some will live out their days in a New York apartment, hiding who they really are. Some will be exiled twice, from 2 different countries. This is not the story of an empire's collapse. It's the story of the people left behind. The story begins in 1922. That year, the Ottoman Sultanate was formally abolished by Turkey's Grand National Assembly. But the Caliphate, the spiritual leadership of the Islamic world, was kept alive a little longer. In November of that year, the assembly elected a member of the dynasty, Abdülmecid Efendi, as Caliph. He was no longer head of state, no longer sultan, just the holder of a religious office. But that compromise didn't last. For the leadership of the young republic, the Caliphate was the last trace of the old order, a potential rallying point for opposition. In March of 1924, the Assembly passed Law No. 431, the law on the abolition of the Caliphate and the expulsion of the Ottoman dynasty from the territories of the Turkish Republic. Even the title packed 2 separate decisions into one sentence. First, the Caliphate was abolished. Second, and far heavier, not just the Caliph, but every single member of the dynasty, men, women, the old and the young, was to be expelled from the country. It was a decision with almost no parallel in world history. When France overthrew its royal family, it executed some, exiled others, but exiling an entire dynasty, hundreds of people, through a single clause of law is a rare example indeed. The law took effect the same day it passed. The family was given hours to prepare, some only minutes. This exile drama had, in fact, already begun quietly a year and a half before Law 431. In November of 1922, when the Sultanate itself was formally abolished, the last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, known as Vahdettin, left the palace through one of its rear gates and was taken to the Dolmabahce Pier, where a launch carried him out to the British warship Malaya, waiting offshore. Long before the Caliphate law, before anyone knew the entire dynasty would be exiled, the last ruler of a 6th-century dynasty had already, quietly, left his country alone. His journey into exile went first to Malta, then to the small coastal town of San Remo in Italy. There, he settled into a modest rented villa. There was no state behind him now, none of the wealth of his old palace. He dictated his memoirs, sometimes writing them himself. A man who had once been the absolute ruler of an empire, now spending his days in a small villa, putting his past down on paper. In May of 1926, at 65 years old, he died of heart failure in San Remo, but even his death brought no peace. He left behind debts, and Italian authorities seized his body, locking his remains in a room, refusing burial until the debts were paid. The body of a man who had once commanded an empire, an entire army and navy, was held for a full month like collateral for an ordinary debt. Eventually, the debts were somehow settled. His remains were carried by ship to Damascus, and in July of that year he was buried at the Süleymaniye Mosque there, not in the land of his own empire, but in another country, in another city, in the courtyard of a foreign mosque. Even before the formal exile law was passed, this was the first sign of just how harsh the dynasty's fate could be. The last ruler of an empire fell into near nothingness the moment he stepped off the throne. Even after his death, his body was treated as a matter of unpaid debt. The Great Exile Law that came 18 months later was, in truth, nothing more than this same lonely, quiet fall, repeated on a far larger scale. The law was carried out with cold, bureaucratic precision. Every member of the dynasty was given exactly one thing: a one-way passport, with no possibility of return. According to various sources, they were also handed somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 British pounds, by today's standards, a modest fortune, but nowhere near enough for a lifetime in exile. Their property in Turkey, palaces, mansions, land, jewels, was seized by the state. Some family members tried at the last moment to smuggle out valuables by sewing them into the linings of their clothes. This detail recurs often in the family's oral history in later years. Perhaps the cruelest clause of the law was this: members of the dynasty could not even pass through Turkish territory in transit. If a ship passed through Turkish waters, if a train crossed Turkish soil, no Ottoman dynasty member could be aboard. Geographically, it cut them off from their homeland completely. How many people were affected? According to various sources, roughly 155, of whom 37 were direct male members of the dynasty, meaning princes theoretically eligible for the throne. The rest were women, children, and spouses. The length of exile itself was unequal: 28 years for the women, 50 years for the men. In practice, a distinction that wasn't written explicitly into the law itself, but emerged later through the scope of subsequent amnesty laws, and entered history that way. These people had no idea they would never see Istanbul again. Perhaps they hoped this was temporary, a political crisis that would resolve itself within a few years. No one could have guessed that half a century of exile lay ahead of them. On the night of March 3rd, word reached Caliph Abdülmecid Efendi, seated in Dolmabahce Palace. He was no longer Caliph, and within hours he would be leaving the country. Istanbul's chief of police came to the palace in person. The Caliph was given only a short time to gather his belongings. He was then put into a car, not a grand ceremonial carriage, just an ordinary official vehicle. The car drove through the dark night roads towards Satalka. There, he was put on the first train bound for Switzerland. With him were his daughter, Durruşehvar Sultan, and his son, Şehzade Ömer Faruk Efendi. By the following evening, the spiritual leader of a 600-year-old dynasty was outside the borders of Turkey. Think about it. A week earlier, this man had sermons delivered in his name at Friday prayers, held the highest spiritual office in the Islamic world. Now, through a train window, perhaps for the last time, he was watching the land of his own country slip away. And it wasn't just his story. That same night, and in the days that followed, dynasty members scattered across the empire, some in Istanbul, some in provincial estates, received the same paper, gathered in the same haste, set off into the same uncertainty. Some went by train to Europe, some by ship to Beirut and Alexandria. In a single night, a family that had lived for centuries in the palaces of Istanbul, in the waterside mansions, along the Bosphorus, princes, sultanas, royal women, scattered across the cities of Europe and the Middle East, Nice, Paris, Vienna, Beirut, Cairo, and further still as far as Damascus. Some took refuge with wealthy relatives, some slept in hotel rooms, some tried to survive by selling the jewels hidden in their luggage. The heirs of an empire had, in a single night, become refugees. The early years of exile were the hardest. Most members of the dynasty had never had to earn money in their lives. Now they tried to get by selling jewelry from their luggage, sometimes with help from foreign governments or wealthy relatives. Some managed a relatively comfortable life, especially those who settled in Egypt, who, through family ties with the Khedival house there, stayed close to royal circles. But for most, the picture was far harsher. An ordinary family renting in small European towns, sending their children to local schools, trying to build a new identity by learning English, French, German. But they could never be truly ordinary. Wherever they went, they carried the shadow of their past. In parts of European high society, they became objects of curiosity, exiled princes and princesses. Journalists occasionally sought them out for interviews, but officially, no state ever granted them diplomatic status. They were simply foreigners carrying ordinary passports, in a status not far from stateless. Children grew up in this world, never seeing the country they came from, knowing Istanbul only through the stories their elders told, through old photographs. For some, Turkish even became a second language. Within this broader picture, three stories stand out in particular. The tragic end of a caliph, a princess who was exiled not once but twice, and a prince who spent more than 60 years quietly living in the middle of New York. Caliph Abdülmecid Efendi's road into exile led first to Montreux in Switzerland, then to Nice in the south of France, and finally to Paris. The years he spent in Nice, and later in Paris, passed like the quiet retirement of a former caliph. He kept up his passion for painting, took an interest in music, but lived far from any trace of power or office. In the early 1940s, the Second World War brought the German occupation of France, and Paris fell under Nazi control. And in those dark days, history produced an unlikely coincidence. 7 French resistance fighters, having escaped the Gestapo, needed somewhere to hide. The place they found was the home of a man who had once been Caliph of the Islamic world. Abdülmecid Efendi took them in. In those days when everyone lived on rationed, limited food, he shared his own portion with these 7 people, risking his own life to do it. It was proof that a man stripped of his throne and exiled from his homeland had not lost his instinct to protect others. Just a few months before the war's end, he suffered a heart attack in Paris and died at 76. It was exactly 20 years since his exile began, but the story didn't end there. In his will, he had asked to be buried in Medina, but his body was denied entry into Saudi Arabia. The political sensitivities of the time made that impossible. His remains were placed in a temporary grave in the basement of Paris's Great Mosque. That temporary wait lasted a full 10 years. For 10 years, the body of a man who had once been the spiritual leader of the largest Islamic state in the world waited in the basement of a mosque in Paris for official permission. Finally, the necessary permits were obtained, and Abdülmecid Efendi's remains were carried to Medina and buried in the sacred ground of the Masjid al-Haram, his final wish fulfilled 10 years after his death. If one story from the exile stands out as the most striking, it is Neslişah Sultan's. She was born in Istanbul in February of 1921. Her lineage doubled the tragedy of the exile by a strange twist of fate. Her father, Şehzade Ömer Faruk Efendi, was the son of the last Caliph, Abdülmecid. Her mother, Sabiha Sultan, was the daughter of the last Ottoman Sultan, Vahdettin. Neslişah Sultan was, in other words, the granddaughter of both the last Sultan and the last Caliph. When the exile order came, she was only 3 years old. She was torn from the land of her birth, alongside her grandfather, Caliph Abdülmecid, at an age too young to understand what was happening. Her childhood passed in Nice, France. The family later moved to Egypt. There she grew up, learning 4 languages: French, English, German, Arabic, and in the early 1940s she married Prince Mohammed Abdelmonem, grandson of Egypt's last Khedive. The marriage gave her a place within the Egyptian royal court. In 1952, a military coup shook Egypt. The king was overthrown, and in one of history's strange twists, Neslişah Sultan's husband was declared regent of the country. Overnight, an exiled Ottoman princess effectively became Egypt's first lady. But this new status didn't last either. In the late 1950s, she was linked to an alleged plot against Gamal Abdel Nasser's government. She was arrested along with her husband, held under house arrest for months, tried before a military court. She was eventually acquitted, but forced to leave Egypt. Think about it. A woman, exiled from one country at just 3 years old. Some 30 years later, exiled from the second country that had taken her in exactly the same way. She lived through the collapse of 2 different empires, the Ottoman and the Egyptian Khedivate, twice in her own lifetime. She and her husband lived in France until the mid-1960s. That year, taking advantage of the return rights granted to women, she settled in Turkey, became a Turkish citizen again, and under the new surname law, took the name Osmanoğlu, finally returning to the land of her birth after nearly 60 years away. In the early 2000s, at 91 years old, she passed away in Istanbul, the city where she was born, and the city from which she had once been exiled. Some exile stories end in dramatic decline. Ertuğrul Osman's took a different path, quiet, humble, and just as remarkable. He was born in Istanbul in August of 1912 at Yıldız Palace. When the exile order came, he was only 12 years old, studying in Vienna. Along with his uncle, Caliph Abdülmecid, and the rest of the dynasty, he became stateless, unable ever to re-enter his own country. He grew up and was educated in Europe. On the eve of the Second World War, he crossed the Atlantic and settled in New York. There he started a small business in the mining industry. A man who had once been heir to an imperial throne, now an ordinary businessman in Manhattan. And here comes the most striking part of the story. For the next 64 years, yes, 64 years. He lived in a modest, rent-controlled apartment on Lexington Avenue. No palace, no mansion. In an ordinary, middle-class Manhattan neighborhood, his neighbors likely had no idea who he really was, and he lived a simple life. In the mid-1990s, as the most senior surviving male member of the dynasty, he became, in name only, the 43rd head of the House of Osman. Of course, he never had a real throne, a real country. In Turkey, he became known over time as the last Ottoman. Journalists began seeking him out in his New York apartment for interviews. In the late 2000s, at 97 years old, he passed away in Istanbul. Though he'd spent most of his life in New York, his final journey took him back to the city of his birth. His funeral was held at the Sultan Ahmed Mosque. High-ranking state officials attended, but perhaps more striking still, thousands of ordinary Istanbul residents poured into the streets to see this man, this last Ottoman, off on his final journey, citizens of the very republic that had exiled his family 85 years earlier. Unusually for history, the exile law contained no expiration date of its own. Dynasty members were, in theory, exiled indefinitely. Change came first for the women. In June of 1952, under the government of Adnan Menderes, a law was passed granting the female members of the dynasty and their children the right to return to Turkey. It was the end of a 28-year wait. For the men, for the princes who could theoretically still claim the throne, the wait was far longer. It wasn't until a general amnesty law, passed on the 15th of May, 1974, Article 8, that the 50-year ban was finally lifted. But there was a bitter side to this victory. When the doors finally opened, that year, of the 37 male dynasty members exiled back in 1924, only 10 were still alive. 27 had died in exile, never seeing their homeland again. Think about it. A prince exiled as an infant, now in his 50s or 60s, perhaps a grandfather himself, finally, as an old man, perhaps in a wheelchair, setting foot on Turkish soil for the first time, or for the first time in decades. Only if he had lived long enough. That number, 37 down to 10, may be the quietest and heaviest sentence in this entire story. Today, the descendants of the Ottoman dynasty live in Turkey under the surname Osmanoğlu. They no longer hold a throne, no longer make any political claim, but a connection to history, identity, and legacy still endures. Some dynasty members have come together through initiatives like the Ottoman Dynasty Foundation, working to connect younger generations with Turkish culture and history. The question of inheritance still plays out in courtrooms. A group of 71 people claiming descent from Sultan Abdülmecid II were, after a 15-year inheritance case, recognized as heirs, though restrictions were placed on the transfer of property. Among historians, more than 80 years on, different voices have begun to be heard. Some argue the law was simply a product of the political necessities of its time. Others believe that exiling the entire dynasty, the women, the children, hundreds of people who posed no political threat at all, went beyond what the moment required. That debate will likely never fully close. But the stories that remain, a caliph's body waiting 10 years in the basement of a Paris mosque, a princess who lived through the fall of 2 empires back to back, a prince who spent 64 years quietly living in the same rented apartment in New York, remind us that history isn't written only on battlefields and in throne rooms. It's written on the roads of exile too, and in small apartments. An empire can vanish from the map in a single night. But the story of the people it leaves behind carries on for decades. The last members of a dynasty that had lasted 6 centuries became stateless overnight. Some died in poverty, some survived quietly, some lived through the same fate twice. But all of them, in one way or another, managed to carry their dignity and their identity through 50 years of exile. On this channel, we keep telling the known and lesser-known sides of Ottoman history, staying true to the sources. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. See you in the next episode.